you, Joseph. And I know he was going to read that word for word. I would have shortened it and saved you some of the details. But thank you. Honored to be here. I think this is my fourth trip to Singapore in the last 5 years, and some of my American friends say, "Wasn't Singapore a really long way away?" And it is. But part of the reason I come back is that a couple things. One is that you should know that the real estate department here and the finance department are nationally recognized. I mean, Ong and Wee and Dang and Mori, some internationally recognized scholars. So I come back not just to enjoy the Singaporean food and other things that I do enjoy, but to have the opportunity to interact with some of NUS's scholars. So, and secondly, I just want to say Singaporeans are uniformly friendly and welcoming. It's such an easy place to visit. You know, from the CEOs of companies to the cab drivers to people you meet in the street. So I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be here. So this is some joint work with. I didn't think you needed a picture of me because I'm standing here, but Indy Naranjo is a longtime collaborator of mine, and Ben Scheidt is a former PhD student who is now a faculty member at Villanova University. When Joseph first mentioned the idea of presenting to you, I said, well, you know, I don't really know. I'm not an expert in international REITs. I don't even know as much as I'd like to know about Singaporean REITs. You know, what could I present that be a credit to Iris and Dr. Seek, and so we settled on this paper. So I hope it's about geography, it's about location, and that kind of matters in real estate. So hopefully you'll find some interest here, and I'll be interested in your sort of reflections on how this applies in a Singaporean context. But you know, one of the most interesting things about commercial real estate, you know, relative to other kinds of asset classes, is that real estate can be purchased both directly and indirectly, right? So if for some reason you thought it was a good time to buy automobile factories or certain stocks or patents, you have to do that via security, right? You have to invest in either publicly traded or private companies, right? You just can't go buy a factory from General Motors. But on the real estate side, investors have that opportunity. So there are, for example, pension funds in the United States that take positions both directly in commercial real estate, right? They take title to the property directly, as well as investing in REITs. In other words, they have sort of a dual investment strategy for getting exposure to commercial real estate. Some pension funds that have rather large real estate portfolios still do not invest in publicly traded real estate investment trusts. And actually, it's the NAREIT people, Brad Case and others, part of their mission is to go around and try to convince the pension funds that do not invest in REITs that they should, that it should be part of their mixed asset portfolio. So you can get exposure, investors can, to real estate both directly and indirectly. So that makes real estate a little bit unique. And these dueling asset markets, or these parallel asset markets, certainly have some interesting ramifications. I mean, think about it. You can get, as an investor, you can get pricing signals from both the private and the public market, right? You don't have that in other industrial kinds of assets, right? So at times, certainly in the U.S., right, the private market seems to be valuing commercial real estate more than the public market, right? In which case there's spin-offs and sell-offs. And sometimes the public market seems to be valuing real estate more highly than the private market. So there's these competing markets with different price signals. And for researchers, that's great because we've got sort of two sources of price signals to look at. But the other thing that it's done, at least in the U.S., is generated this discussion about, well, what's the best way to invest in real estate? And so one of the things Brad Case does, one of the NAREIT guys, when he goes to a pension fund, is to try to provide evidence of, well, how would your portfolio have performed had you been invested in REITs as well as investing in real estate directly? So there's this big debate about whether or not the best vehicles, the public vehicle or the private vehicle. And in the long run, they ought to be kind of similar, right? I mean, in the long run, REITs hold real estate, right? And the rules, as Mancho mentioned, vary across different REIT structures across the world, but in the U.S., 75% of income and 75% of assets have to be have to be real estate. So in the long run, if you're investing in a REIT, you're investing in commercial real estate, right? So you're purchasing the cash flows of those properties. But in the short run, what we see is that there's a lot of variation in return performance, right? If you look at the return performance of the public vehicle and the return performance of the private vehicle, there's a lot of variation in performance, at least according to the standard indices that we have to look at it in measure performance. So what that's done, at least in the US, has generated this long-standing debate, which is, are REITs real estate or are they stocks? Right? Well, they're stocks that own real estate, right? So I think that it's kind of a question that gets a little bit too focused on in a way. But one way to look at that is to look at performance. So it's a bit of a busy graph, but the blue line are all publicly traded REITs, 1996 through 2013. So that blue line is publicly traded REITs, valuated index. The red line is the so-called NCREIF NPI. NCREIF is the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries. The NPI is the NCREIF Property Index. So they produce, on a quarterly basis, an index of total returns on institutional quality properties. So they collect not just asset price information, but they collect information on the net operating income and capital expenditures of the properties. So I've asked my Singaporean friends, they tell me that Singapore doesn't have yet an analog to what NCREIF produces. You have price indices, right, estimates of what's going on with commercial real estate prices, but this is an index that is an index of total returns, right? So it captures both changes in asset values as well as the actual dividend stream being produced by the properties, right? So this private index allows people to focus on this question, how do the total returns in the public market compare to the total returns in the private market, right? And so the blue line, as you suspect, is more volatile. There's reasons for that. One is that REITs are leveraged in the institutional, the private market return index is unlevered, no leverage, right? So you expect to see more volatility. But the problem is that many researchers just take these two indices and kind of run with the analysis. They do compare mean returns, standard deviations, do tests of co-integration over the long run. But the problem is that they've not really adjusted carefully for how these portfolios are different. Okay? And that's a part of what we're trying to do. In a minute, I'll get to the sort of the last, I think, is an innovation, is we actually look at geography. MSA is Metropolitan Statistical Area. You can think of it as there's about 350 or 60 in the U.S. It's the urban core plus some of the suburbs, right? So you can think of it as the city. It excludes the rural areas, but think of them as the cities, MSAs, in this context. So again, just so you understand my benchmark, because I'm going to keep talking about NPI, right? It's evaluated total return index on properties that have been invested in by institutional investors in the U.S. It's unlevered, and it's only core property types: industrial, office, retail, in apartments, rental, residential. Okay, so that's what's in the NCREIF. All right, so if we're going to compare these two, so think of this as a little bit of a horse race, right? Who performed better, the public market or the private market? Well, to make that comparison sort of legit, you have to make sure that you're understanding the differences. So the first thing we do is we unlever the REIT returns, right? At the REIT level, we use standard procedures for sort of taking the leverage out of those returns. Because again, REITs are levered. Okay, not all REITs are levered to varying degrees. The private market benchmark is not. Then we exclude REITs that are not core property types. So Mancho mentioned timber REITs, but in the U.S., there are REITs that invest in prisons. In other words, they actually rent prisons to state and federal governments to house prisoners, I guess what you put in a prison. There are self-storage REITs. There are diversified REITs, right? So if you're going to run this horse race between public and private, you got to make sure that the property type mix is the same. And in the U.S., if you look at this graph, which is just the number of core REITs 96 through 2013. This is number of core REITs. What you see is toward the end of the sample period, only about 50% of U.S. REITs are core. Remember, core is office, industrial, retail, and apartments, right? So it's kind of an unfair comparison, public versus private, if you don't throw out those non-core REITs, at least for this analysis. And again, many study after study does not do this. And then we also adjust the MPI returns downward to reflect the fact that the REIT returns are measured after all expenses, right? Those are net returns to investors. It turns out that the MPI returns are measured gross of expenses, so we have to make some adjustment, and we use 80 basis points per year, which has some justification in the literature, right? So if you make all of those adjustments, okay, this is what that prior graph looks like. The REITs, instead of outperforming 92 basis points annually, it now looks like 23 basis points annually. So still, the REIT guys like this a little bit because they can say, well, according to Professor Ling's studies, REITs have outperformed even after making these adjustments. 23 basis points, by the way, is not statistically significant, but sometimes industry guys don't get too focused on statistical significance, right? It's the academics that get all stressed out about, sort of statistical and economics significance. But what's missing in this whole comparison, we've adjusted for leverage and property mix and management fees, but no one said, well, where are these properties located? I mean, what portion of that difference between the return performance of the public vehicles and the return performance of the private vehicles, how much of that is due to different MSA locations, right? So Singapore is sort of one big MSA in my mind, right? And so unless you are investing internationally, this issue doesn't come up. But still, I think you're all aware about the importance of submarkets. So hopefully, even in a Singapore context, the next step, if we had the data, would be to take this not just to the MSA level, but to the sub-MSA level, right? Because obviously there's a difference between central city, Singapore, and non-central city, et cetera. Right, so this is what we decided to do, and no one's actually done this. I mean, location matters, right? I mean, the first thing we teach our students, at least in the US, it's such a cliche, right? The three most important things about real estate are location, location, location. Yet in all these analyses, no one's ever adjusted for location. Part of that was because the data were not available until just recently, right? Sometimes we as academics have good ideas, sometimes. But sometimes we're limited by the data, right? We just can't address some issues because the data are not available. So we actually can get the location of these properties. So, no details, but what we know from SNL, so SNL is a database that's available to anyone, not free of charge, but it is available. We know the location of every property owned by every REIT at the beginning of each year, right? Which is kind of interesting, we think. So what we do is we can compute the percent, we can compute a REIT's exposure, okay, to different MSAs on an annual basis. And we do that, we weight a couple of different ways. I won't bore you with the details, but we evaluate the exposures of REITs, and then we compare that to the exposures of the private market, which we can get from NCREIF. Okay, so we know where the properties, the REIT properties are, we know where the the private market properties are. So the first thing we do, and maybe you'll find this interesting, is that the U.S. investors are I would say, obsessed with gateway cities. Okay, I didn't define these gateway cities. These are the 6 gateway cities that are standard in a discussion about the gateway cities. And 5 of these 6, as you can see, are on the coastal area. Chicago, well, it's on the coast of Lake Michigan, but it's not, it's not on the east or west coast. And if you talk to institutional investors in the U.S., what they'll often say is that their strategy is strictly a gateway city strategy, right? They don't invest in anything that's not a gateway city. And the reason for that is that these gateway MSAs are thought to have some pretty nice properties. One is more liquidity, right? So more transactions in a market means that if you want to sell, you can sell more quickly at market value. So liquidity is valuable. And investors tell me and other people that these markets are more liquid. As opposed to Gainesville, Florida, where I live, is an MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area, of 100,000 people, relative to New York, San Francisco, Chicago, et cetera. And the other thing that is important about these cities is that there are constraints on new development. Right? It's difficult to build new housing in downtown Boston or downtown New York. Right? In places like Phoenix, Las Vegas, right? There's limited constraints on new supply. So if you're thinking about investing, what you care about is how quickly you think rents are going to grow, right? And if you're afraid of new production, new construction coming online to drive down rents, right? You care about that, right? It's more regulated here. The federal government, as I understand it, sort of parcels out these land parcels for auctions, right? So there's a lot of government involvement in how fast development can occur in Singapore. That's not the case in the U.S. and many other countries, right? It's all, these parcels are privately owned, not publicly owned. And so institutional investors are heavily focused on these supply-constrained markets. And sometimes, this is just an example of an industry executive who came to campus a year or so ago and was talking about their great strategy. This is a large publicly traded REIT that owns apartments, and he was telling the students that their strategy was to sell apartment properties that were selling at 7% cap rate, sort of the current yield, and buying properties at a 4.5% cap. And this seemed like a great strategy. And I didn't say anything to him at the time because we went to dinner afterwards and I pressed him on this. But this is a strategy that's betting on an awful lot of growth in those gateway markets, right? And so if we think about what we learned from Professor Ong and Professor Wee and others, right? A simple model of total return is the cap rate, plus the expected growth in the rental rate. Well, if you're selling at a 7% cap. 7% cap, and you have a 9% required rate of return, you only need 2% growth in rents, right, to make that total return. If you're buying a 4.5% cap to get that 9% return, you need a lot more growth, right? And so now you could argue that the required return in these MSAs, gateway markets, is a little bit lower, so it's not 9%, it might be 8%, but still the point is, this strategy never made a lot of sense to me necessarily as the exclusive strategy that institutions should go after. And then just the other day, I was just reading the Straits Times at breakfast over at my hotel room and thinking about this presentation. And lo and behold, I read this article that was talking about just the attractiveness of commercial real estate investment and where some of these experts would put their money if they had money to invest. And one, when asked about the attractive international investment opportunities, a Singapore-based expert said, gateway cities in the U.S. will also do well, right? So this notion of gateway cities in the U.S. as being the place where institutional capital should invest, right, is obviously an international view, at least among some international investors. So that begs the question, so how have gateway cities performed, right, relative to non-gateway? Okay, so there are, I can certainly send you the paper if you want some details, but what this says is over the 18-year study period, 96 to 2013, apartment properties in gateway markets have outperformed non-gateway markets by about 13 basis points, 0.12% per quarter. Okay, so, and if you add up across core properties, the outperformance has been about 26 basis points on a quarterly basis. So that would say, if you take that 26 basis points and multiply it by 4, for core property types, the outperformance of gateway cities has been about 1 percentage point per year. Well, you compound 1 percentage point a year, that's probably statistically significant, right? There is some outperformance there. There's a lot of details I'd like to talk about, but don't have time. Where you see the most outperformance is in the office sector, right? And that kind of makes sense to me, right? You think about office properties and investing in an office property in a core market is probably more important on average than investing in an apartment complex or a condo complex in a core market. And so there's some interesting things here that vary by property type. But the implication is that these different allocations should affect relative performance, right? So on the one hand, I almost kind of liked when we put this data together that gateways didn't outperform, right? Because I kind of told you over a decade, I've gotten a little tired, I thought, of hearing institutional people tell me the gateway markets are where they invest. And maybe this is just a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe so many investors have invested in gateway properties that they have performed well. And there's some evidence here that this is kind of tapered off in recent years, if you look at the last 6-year period. So there's interesting stuff here, but I don't really have time to go into a lot of details. But the issue now is, if there's difference in performance, gateway versus non-gateway, well, what are the allocations? So I've got, how do the public market allocations to these gateway markets compare to non-gateway? And I can show you lots, we've got more graphs than time, but let me just show you this one. So this is gateway, this is public versus private. So these are the REITs are in red, the private guys, girls are in blue, right? So for gateway apartments, about 50% of REITs are invested strictly in the gateway markets, right? And the private guys, the last couple of years, more like 34, 35%, right? And so I've got graphs of this for apartments, I've got graphs for this industrial, for office, for retail, and then also by MSA. And what you see, you'll have to trust me because I can't show you too many graphs here. What you'll see is that there's a lot of variation over time and across markets in the concentration of the public portfolio in these gateway markets versus the private market portfolios. And that variation ought to drive performance. So here's sort of getting to the meat of this particular study. What we want to do is create some MSA identical portfolios. I'd like to do a comparison of the public market to the private market that holds constant geography, right? Because that will tell me, if nothing else, how much of the difference in return performance is driven by geography. Right? It'd be fun to do this for Singapore, just if you had data on the different districts, or however you want to think about the different submarkets. So there's an awful lot going on here, but if I could get you to focus down here, this is one of our weighting measures. This is for core property types. So this says that if I re-weight the, so here's what I've got. I've got NACREIF private market returns for 340 some MSAs. Okay. I know the reallocations to the different MSAs. So what we do is we take the total returns, the private market total returns for each MSA, and then we aggregate those, or we weight those MSA returns to have the same weight as the public market portfolio. Right, so I've got a return from Gainesville, Florida, right? I've actually got that from NACREIF. Well, if there is no, the public market's not invested in NACREIF, so that my private market total return for Gainesville will get no weight. But what I do is I aggregate up, right? So does that make sense? I'm taking the next 10 minutes won't make sense if I don't convey this, right? So I'm taking the private market MSA level returns, and I'm re-weighting those based on the MSA weights that we see in the public market. Right? So then we build up a total return by property type, right, that has the same private market return, that has the same MSA geographic dispersion or distribution as the public market. And after doing all that, well, I shouldn't say I did it, of course, Ben, the former PhD student, actually does all the work. I just present stuff. But this is the difference between the re-weighted MPI return and the unre-weighted MPI return, a difference of 1.4 basis points, 0.01% quarterly over that time period. So after all of that, if you look at long time periods, it doesn't make any difference, right? It's sort of a reversion to the mean. If you look at by quarter though, there's a lot of variation. So again, just to be clear, this is the re-weighted private market index, taking the private market index, re-weighting it to have the same weights as the public market, and then subtracting off the reported, the raw NPI. Well, if reweighting makes a difference, then the difference between these two should be big. But over long periods, it's small. But what you see is a lot of variation from quarter to quarter, right? So these differences are centered around 0, but there's a lot of variation in over time in what? In the allocations that the public market has versus the allocations that the private market has. And so the last thing we do, and what I've got until, I didn't even look, 10 minutes? 10 minutes? So the last thing we want to do is to kind of ask formally, and some of you may be familiar with attribution analysis, maybe a finance professor made you learn it at some point in time, maybe you've forgotten it, but this is our application of attribution analysis. And so what we want to ask formally is, how much of the difference between the returns in the public market and the private market are driven by MSA allocations? Nobody's been able to address that, right? So the question is, we want to explain this difference. So this is the difference between REIT returns, this is property type F at time t. But essentially we want to explain the difference between REIT returns and private market returns. And we want to take that difference and say how much of that is due to how they allocated to these different MSAs versus how much of that is due to their selection and management of properties within an MSA, right? So this is New York. So does it matter, you know, is really what's important is the MSA allocation, or is it when you decide to go to New York, is it where you decide to buy within New York, right? That's the question we can address with our data. So we want to break that return into, is it superior allocation, or is it selection and management once you've chosen the MSA? And as some of you know from, if you've ever worked with these attribution models, there's an interaction effect that you have to allocate. You know, I won't say too much about that. I'll just ask you to trust me that we've done it correctly. But, we have. All right, so a couple of slides. So I want you, here's the takeaway. The main takeaway is that this is the unlevered REIT return minus the raw private market return. Right, so what does this tell you out here for this full sample period? This is REIT minus private. So who outperformed? This is REIT minus private. Okay, private outperformed, right? Because if you take, so by this is 12 basis points. The question we want to answer is how much of that differential performance is it attributable to MSA allocation versus how much is it attributable to selection and management. And what you see, if you look at the absolute, I don't know if you can see it back there. Is anybody awake back there? If you look at the magnitude of these, right, one is, what you see is the allocation effect is small, maybe 2 basis points relative to the selection effect. Right, so what does this tell you? So REIT managers underperformed, so relative to the private market, but REIT managers actually outperformed slightly with respect to allocation, but they lost it all on selection and management. Well, I'm a long way from my NAREIT friends, right? So I could probably, I'd have to be careful in some audiences. But let me just say that this is consistent with them, at least during this time frame, not managing and selecting as well as the private market. And again, I don't know if I've been able to motivate this well or not, but the public market guys, the private market guys and girls, I mean, they fight over this, right? And this is a big deal, you know, whether or not the public is outperforming the private market and as to why. So the same story in recent years, right? REITs have underperformed to a larger degree, but again, do you see that this piece is small in magnitude relative to this? Right, so that's my story. My story, what we consistently find is that when you take that differential performance and you break it up into allocation and selection and management, the allocation piece is really small, right? It just doesn't seem to be very big. And that was industrial. We could do this for, I can show you the same thing for retail. Again, this allocation effect is small relative to selection in management. Right, so key takeaways. Significant differences in MSA portfolio allocations between public and private markets. I mean, the industry guys have always known that they allocated public differently from private, but I presented this a couple of times to some industry groups, and they love those graphs. I mean, you know, you can imagine if this is your world, U.S. world, they love those graphs. I'll share my slides with you for free, but maybe I'm not so generous. No, I'm kidding. I'll give it to the industry guys at home as well. This allocation has a surprise. These differences in allocations have a surprisingly small impact on average returns over longer time periods. So what does that say? You know, it says that certain MSAs get hot, but there's a reversion to the mean with respect to total return. That's what it tells me. Large differences over shorter time horizons, right? So it really does matter a bit more over shorter time horizons. So property selection and management within an MSA, more important than allocations across MSAs. Again, this is where I get into trouble with some of my other industry friends, right? So I know people at CV Richard Ellis and Jones Lang LaSalle and other providers, REITs and other providers of data to investors. And what you see is that CV Richard Ellis, for example, makes quite a bit of money, I would assume, selling, for example, rent forecasts for apartments in different MSAs. So industry people in the U.S. spend, in my view, a lot of time going to seminars. Is it a good time to invest in Boston? Is it a good time to invest in Atlanta? They're really, really focused on MSA and MSA allocation. And I've always thought, but didn't have the data to back it up, that maybe that wasn't such a good way to spend their time, right? That maybe they needed to be more concerned about property selection and management. So I'm happy that the results of this study kind of confirm my long-held bias, right? That knowing somebody's getting some estimate of how rents are going to grow over the next 10 years, I just wasn't quite sure how that was going to help you make your allocation decision. This framework can be applied at the manager level. So I guess if a REIT called me up and wanted me to benchmark their performance against the private market, I could do that. That would certainly not be for free, but we could certainly do that with this kind of data, right? So we've looked at this at the sector level, REITs versus private market, but you could do this for individual managers as well, right? And ask how much of their relative performance has been due to their allocation decisions versus their selection and management decisions. Right. So I have 2 minutes, don't I? So this is my own sort of take spin on this. I've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to give it to you, and so I still have the mic in front of me. So my story. This is what I've been telling industry people for years. First of all, diversification is a powerful tool. Right? It is truly the one free lunch in financial economics. Right? So the things some of the students may have heard from your professors is really true, right? I mean, you're leaving money on the table if you're not well diversified. It brings up a question that Professor Cho mentioned, which is there's this kind of conflict between specialization in a market that the real estate folks know versus diversification, right? So there's this tension between knowing that diversification matters, but also wanting to apply your comparative advantage that you might have because you know Boston, in my world, you know Boston, or you know LA, or you know San Francisco, right? But diversification is a tool. So my story is, based on this analysis, is that you need to be diversified, but probably naive diversification is as good as informed diversification. In other words, I would tell institutional investors, don't buy rent forecasts from CV Richard Ellis. And there's nobody from CV Richard Ellis in the room. But because what you should spend your money on is what? If I'm telling them not to buy rent forecasts from CV Richard Ellis, what am I telling them to buy? Spend their money on. So institutional investors have a budget. What do they spend their money on? You know this. Somebody else, a student. What am I telling the institutional investors to spend their money on? What? If it's not MSA level research, it's wait a minute. Come on, somebody. I didn't do that bad of a job of explaining this, did I? What am I saying? Yeah, spend that money on putting another person or two in the field, right? Spend that money on putting somebody into the field to understand the submarkets in Atlanta, where to buy in Atlanta. Don't go to some conference that has somebody, ex-academic runs some econometric model that shows you what rents are going to do for 10 years. That's not. So I feel a little strongly about it. But so naive diversification strategy. And again, I've always thought that people spend too much time on MSA selection and not enough time on learning those local markets and executing the deals, right? Literally having somebody that's knowledgeable enough and knows how to buy low and sell high, I mean, to some extent. All right, so this is my last slide, and this is I'm sorry, this is a little self-promotional, but I couldn't resist. About 10 years ago, I wrote a paper that is consistent with these findings. So 10 years ago, I said, in addition to pursuing a naive diversification strategy, we recommend investors focus on deal specifics, including the analysis of the immediate market area, due diligence, underwriting, and negotiations. In short, we recommend investors focus on both big picture diversification, but do it perhaps in a naive way, right? You don't have to study the diversification. And effective deal execution, right? Spend more time at the transaction than at the MSA level. Did somebody tell this gentleman to come in and shut me down? So you came into my last sentence, right? And so the acquisition and analysis of MSA level forecast should be a casual hobby, not an activity upon which valuable resources are expended. So that's sort of my view. I think this latest study is kind of consistent, I think, with the notion that selection and management is probably more important than decisions to allocate across cities. So you'll be happy to know I'm finished. Thank you. Do I stay here? All right. Be nice.
David, very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Just curious about, let's just take apartments, for example. Okay, I'm just saying that taking apartment, your example, did you exclude any outliers? Example, if you take New York, New York had to be a very big outlier compared to most other MSAs.
A big, in what sense, Doctor?
In the sense that if you look at apartments, it's very constrained, it's always under supply
right.
of apartments.
Right.
So rents are going to be extremely, enjoying high growth, generally speaking. So would that have thrown out, you've taken some of the, assuming they are outliers,
right.
Would that make any difference to your numbers?
It's a good question. We did not we didn't do it for individual MSAs, right? And again, my argument would be that New York is supply constrained, therefore rents are very high, and you're protected against future supply, but you're paying for that at acquisition, right? So you're paying for that with a much lower yield. So the New York investors have to get quite a bit more growth just to make up for the growth that they're not getting had they invested in Raleigh, North Carolina, or somewhere else. So the empirical question is, on average, are they getting, they're paying high prices, getting low yields, and the evidence seemed to suggest, at least over our study period, that even with those high prices and low yields, that the gateway markets are outperforming slightly, which I assume includes New York. So I didn't mean to filibuster my answer, but no, we didn't look at New York. We didn't throw it out, and that's.
I was thinking the non-supply places like LA, like Phoenix, and so on. You do anything you want.
Correct.
And that's why they had the worst hit after
Right.
the 2008 crash.
Right.
Because New York maintained its price very well. So it's
It-
also lower
right.
volatility in that sense, right?
Yeah, and again, that's part of why the New York investors are willing to accept lower cap rates at acquisition, lower current yields. One is because they think their rent growth is protected, and two, they do believe that these assets are more liquid and less volatile, as compared to, say, what happened in Phoenix and Vegas and a few other places. Yeah, so we could definitely focus and do some sort of case studies on individual MSAs and see if doing so added up to any insights.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting study you've done. I think it ties in with what intuitively all of us know, that property selection is important. But I just want to go back to your analysis between public and private market. I think to quote an academic, 14 basis points is not statistical meaningful, but anyway.
You'll take it?
Yeah. So if you look, I think you know a public vehicle is a levered vehicle, right? So as you look at the total returns and it's publicly traded, I just wondered, as you adjust for the leverage, how much of the return is impacted by the way the vehicle is levered and the effects of leverage, and whether you adjusted for it. Because like, for example, in Singapore, for example, in a simple market, when Fed announces that it's going to increase interest rates, all the REITs reacted very strongly to it.
Right.
So, you know, that obviously has an impact on your return.
Right.
So as you adjust the effects of leverage in your comparison at the property level,
Yeah.
at the portfolio level, do you adjust accordingly at the return level?
Yes. So we all the analysis, the attribution analysis, allocation analysis was all done using REIT returns that were unlevered. And I can show you, I think, really quickly here. Maybe not. Yeah, I'm getting there. Hang on. You getting busy? I can answer that question, I think. Yeah, so these are REIT returns that are adjusted for leverage. So over this sample period at least, the unlevered REIT return was 9% and change. And if you look at the prior slide, I think it was, what was it, 10, public market was 10.5%, right? So the unlevered returns are an average it's 9% annual total return versus 10.5% annual return. So unlevering the REIT returns does make a difference, both in terms of the mean return and the volatility of those returns. So, and we've adjusted for that.
The leverage must be quite low because the difference is very small.
Yeah, the difference. Yeah, REITs. So equity REITs are have average rate leverage of about 30 to 40% in the U.S. That's time varying, but in recent years it's been sort of 35-40%. So so in the U.S. REITs are less levered than regular industrial firms, but at 35% they're clearly REITs are more levered than industrial firms, but at 35% they're obviously quite a bit less levered than their private market counterparts, right? The private guys, girls tend to use quite a bit more leverage. They tend to use as much leverage as they can find, right? So the public market is different. Yeah.
Related point, but you know, and the difference is not that large, and you know what the other difference is between the public and private markets is liquidity.
Right.
And you know that difference is probably, in my mind anyway, not sufficient to compensate for the difference in liquidity. I mean, I would imagine that it could be even larger than that.
Well, so this is the levered REITs, right? So this has leverage in it, and you're saying that 92 basis points. So this says the REIT guys. Brad Case likes this slide because it says that the REITs outperformed, and they're more liquid, right? In other words, what we learned from school, right, is that if liquidity is value, we would expect more leveraged assets to produce lower returns on average, right? Because the more liquidity there is, the less risk there is, the less compensation they have to provide to investors. So the REIT guys like this because they say REITs have outperformed slightly, maybe it's statistically significant, maybe it's not, but they've also provided more liquidity. But what do the private market guys say? What do they focus on in this graph? What do they say back to the REIT guys? There's a lot of volatility in that return, right? Right, and so, yeah. Did I answer your question? No, I didn't answer that. Oh, I did? Okay. All right.
But there's a whole saying, liquidity is a problem when you concept.
Yeah. But still, I think, yeah, the value of liquidity is time varying. it has different value in peaks than in troughs, but I think everyone would agree that liquidity has some value.
And whilst I've got the microphone, maybe a comment. Your final conclusion. How much of it is really a factor of this self-referential aspect of investor behavior? So they're all attending the same conferences, they're all listening to the same advice.
They do.
Rental forecasts, and therefore everybody's turning into the same trades, and therefore over the long run,
Right.
everybody's returns mean return.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. And I think they do go to the same conferences and listen to the same advice. They're obviously not listening to me. Why should they? Yeah, I agree. All right, have I earned lunch? Joseph, do I get lunch?
Quick
Okay.
question.
Still have time for questions.
Okay.
That chart suggests to me that there seems to be a lag factor between the REITs to the all property return, something like 2 to 3 quarters. Any explanation on that?
Yeah, so I look at this and I see the blue line leading the red line, right? So, and that would kind of make sense because REITs are the public vehicle and prices react a little more quickly. This is also exacerbated by the fact that the red line is the private market, and I didn't talk about this, but that it's the appreciation component of the private market return in any quarter is based on an appraised value if the property did not sell, right? So that the capital gain component in that red line is often based primarily on changes in appraised values, right? And no offense to valuers, but those values tend to lag a little bit. And so what I'm trying to say is that red line is artificially smooth, which makes it look like the public market is really leading the private.
Sorry, just one more question.
Sure.
Looking at this graph, obviously over the short term, a lot of arbitrage opportunities within the public and private market. In your research, have you found much of that happening? The arbitraging during those periods when there are huge gaps between the red and blue line?
Yes. So one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk was this idea that you've got price signals coming from two markets. And what happens is in the U.S. is that the investment banks and some other firms calculate these price to net asset value ratios, right? So I look at price per share divided by the asset value per share, and this stuff is distributed. And so what's the signal when prices are high relative to the private market, right? That signals that capital should flow from one market to the other. So for example, Professor Cho pointed that period in 2004, 2005, 2006, there were the number of REITs shrank by about 100 or about a third because of going private transactions, right? So when those signals that I would argue are a little more visible in the real estate markets because of this public-private that's traded in both markets, when those signals get way out of whack, different, then you see that kind of behavior. So yes, there's times when you've got all these going private transactions, and then there's times when you've got REITs buying assets out of the private market, trying to arbitrage, that difference. I like this stuff. Can you tell? This is fun.
Your analysis is done on a annual basis, right? Cross-sectional annual basis. You do it over a long.
No, it's done. The analysis is done quarterly, but we can only observe the private market allocations annually. So the allocations stay fixed for a year, but the return date is quarterly.
So in your attribution analysis, you kind of split the difference, performance difference into geography as well as in terms of between the property selection and the marketing.
Right.
What about riding, in terms of market timing, in terms of riding the market cycles, where would that come in because some investors are holding for 10 years or so, right? They're not just doing it on a year-by-year basis. So would that skills be?
So the ability to time at least MSA allocations is captured in our analysis. In other words, that allocation component measures the extent to which the ability to sort of pick MSAs in time acquisitions and dispositions. So that is picked up in that allocation piece. So in other words, how good are managers at timing either putting capital in or taking capital out at the MSA level? It's captured in the allocation piece. Yeah, it's a good question.
All right, thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thank you.